Hi there, I'm Shaul Mago, and I'd like to tell you about good enough synthesis. This is a joint work with Orna Kupferman. Let's start by recalling the traditional LTL synthesis paradigm. There, we are given as inputs an LTL formula phi over two sets of atomic propositions, I, inputs controlled by the environment, and O, outputs controlled by a system. We then use a synthesis machine, yours may not look exactly like this one, which outputs a transducer that realizes the formula, if one exists. This transducer is a system which interacts with an environment and guarantees that every interaction results in a computation that satisfies phi. Let's see an example of synthesis. Consider the formula always a request implies that eventually there is a grant, where requests are inputs and grants are outputs. That is, every request from the environment should be eventually followed by a grant from the system. Can this formula be realized? Certainly. Here is a transducer that realizes it. Whenever it sees a request, it immediately issues a grant. And if a request is not given, it does not issue a grant. Now let's try another example. This time we want that infinitely often we see both a request and immediately a grant, and infinitely often we see no request and no grant. Well, this formula is not realizable. And the reason it's not realizable is that the system cannot force the environment to output infinitely many requests and infinitely many non-requests. Well, that's not really fair, is it? Alright, well, how about if the environment gives a hopeful computation, one that does have infinitely many requests and non-requests? Well, in this case, the same transducer above works just fine. So while this formula is not realizable, I would say it is good enough. Okay, some formal definitions. We work with formulas over input signals I and output signals O, and we model systems by strategies, which are usually given by transducers. A strategy takes a sequence of input signals, each of which is a subset of I, and outputs an output signal, which is a subset of O. Then, given an infinite input sequence such as X here, the strategy generates an infinite sequence of outputs, and this induces the infinite computation here. We then say that F realizes the formula if for every input x, the induced computation satisfies the formula. This is all completely standard. We're now ready for the new definitions. An input sequence x is hopeful if it can be matched with some output sequence such that the induced computation satisfies the formula. Note that crucially this does not mean that y can be generated by a strategy. It just means that there is some match for x. We now say that a strategy f good enough realizes phi, or just GE realizes phi, if for every hopeful input sequence x, the induced computation satisfies the formula. And the fundamental problem we start with is GE synthesis. Given a formula, compute a transducer that GE realizes it, or report that there is no such transducer. Wow, look at all the colors. The notion of GE synthesis can be placed in the broader spectrum of limiting the environment in synthesis. Other approaches in this direction include adding direct assumptions on the environment, bounding the size and hence the computational power of the environment's implementation, or by adding a separate goal for the environment, making it more rational than hostile. GE synthesis is also closely related to works on dominant strategies. The strategies we look for may not be winning in the synthesis game, but they are good enough in the sense that they dominate all other strategies for the system. And there are several works on that. Results time. The first thing we show is that GE synthesis is 2x time complete. This is great news as it matches the complexity of traditional synthesis. 2x time hardness does not trivially follow from that of traditional synthesis, but the same reduction used to show hardness for synthesis in fact works for GE synthesis as well. We won't go into that. A quick sketch of how we show membership in 2x time. We first employ the logic QLTL, which extends LTL with some quantification. We can use it to state the fact that x is hopeful by saying that x satisfies the formula exists outputs such that phi, because indeed x is hopeful exactly when there exist matching outputs such that the induced computation satisfies phi. This is what exists outputs such that phi means. We can now say that a transducer T GE realizes phi if and only if T realizes in the traditional sense the formula phi or for all outputs not phi. And this is because this formula says that for every input x, either the computation induced by T satisfies phi itself or x is not hopeful. So now all we need to do is solve synthesis for this formula. We do this via a sequence of automata constructions. We start with the LTL formula phi, and use the Vardy-Wolpert translation to non-deterministic Büchi automata to obtain an automaton that is equivalent to phi, and an automaton that is equivalent to the negation of phi. These constructions involve a single exponential blowup. We now take the automaton for phi and introduce more non-determinism by projecting away the outputs. This gives us a non-deterministic automaton equivalent to the formula exists output such that phi. Note that there is no blowup in size here, just possibly adding edges. We now take the product of this automaton with that of the negation of phi, and end up with a non-deterministic automaton for the negation of phi and exists output such that phi. We now take this automaton and dualize it. Instead of a non-deterministic Büchi automaton, we get a universal co-Büchi automaton for the complement language, which is exactly the formula we were looking for. Observe that this involves no blowup at all. Finally, synthesis for universal co-Büchi automata can be solved in x time, giving us a total of 2x time. A nice feature of this construction is that it doesn't go through deterministic automata, so we avoid a Safra construction, which means that our construction should relatively handle optimizations well. Alright, we solved the basic question. But wait, there is more. GE synthesis invites many types of extensions, some borrowed from similar ideas in traditional synthesis and some are new. We'll now look at a few of them. Adding strong guarantees, which essentially combines the traditional and the GE settings. Raising flags, which indicate the hopefulness status of inputs. Quantitative extensions, taking us beyond the Boolean setting, and the stochastic setting. We'll start with the strong guarantees setting, where in addition to the formula phi, which we now call phi weak, we are also given another formula, phi strong. The problem is then to find a transducer that realizes phi strong as well as GE realizes phi weak. You can think of phi strong as requirements that have to be met no matter what. For example, the machine should not explode. Whereas phi weak should be satisfied if it's at all possible. For example, issue infinitely many grants for requests as long as infinitely many requests are given. We show that this problem is also 2x time complete. The proof is by appropriate modifications of the automata construction we showed earlier. The next extension we look at involves raising flags. The motivation is that as the system interacts with the environment, it typically doesn't know if the given input is going to be hopeful or not. But sometimes we can determine after a finite prefix if the input is going to be hopeful. Suppose we have some word over inputs and outputs, such that after seeing it, the language of remaining suffixes is realizable, in the traditional sense. We call such words green, or green flags. We lift this to input words by saying that an input word is green if there is some output that would make it green. The nice thing about green prefixes is that we can identify them using a monitor, which is just a deterministic finite automaton with outputs. So if we equip our transducer with such a monitor, it can raise a flag whenever a green prefix has been seen, and we can be assured that from now on the formula is realizable. And if our transducer is GE realizing, then we are also assured that the formula will be satisfied. We can think of green flags as giving information about satisfaction. There are some other flags we can consider. Red flags tell us that no matter what output was given, all the remaining suffixes are doomed not to satisfy the formula, so we can give up. Dually, blue flags tell us that there exists an output such that every remaining suffix satisfies the formula. So from now on, there is no reason to actually look at the inputs as anything will work. We can construct monitors for these flags as well. The next extension we look at is the quantitative setting. This extension already exists for traditional LTL synthesis, where instead of asking whether a formula is satisfied, we ask how well it is satisfied. There are many quantitative extensions to LTL. Here we consider LTL-F, which extends LTL to a multi-value domain by allowing the designer to introduce arbitrary quantitative operators. I'll demonstrate this logic with an example. Suppose I'm riding in an autonomous car, and I realize this is completely unrealistic since we're no longer allowed to go outside, but we're aiming at future technologies. My car has an acceleration control, which normally should keep it in a relatively constant speed. However, if the car recognizes a long stretch of road that is obstacle-free, it should accelerate to optimize time travel. We formalize this requirement as always, if the road is safe, then accelerate for 2 consecutive steps, and this operator means weighted average. If we accelerate for 2 steps, the satisfaction value is 1. If we only accelerate in the first step, we get a satisfaction value of 2/3, and if we only accelerate on the second step, we still get 1/3 satisfaction. So this prioritizes the acceleration over the 2 steps. Now, if at some point the car recognizes an obstacle, then it should similarly decelerate for 2 consecutive steps, this time with a weighted average of 3/4, making it more important to slow down immediately. Finally, we're of course not allowed to accelerate and decelerate simultaneously. So can this formula be realized? Or more accurately, with what value can it be realized? Well, not with value 1. The reason is that a priori, there is nothing preventing obstacles and safe stretches to appear in alternating steps, in which case we cannot either accelerate or decelerate for 2 consecutive steps. But we still want to do the best possible, since in reality most roads do not have alternating moves. But we don't want to add this as an explicit assumption either. This is what GE synthesis does in the quantitative case. It guarantees the best possible results for each input. That is, for each road condition, the synthesized autonomous car has to obtain the maximal satisfaction value that is possible for that road condition. Note that this is not achievable with current definitions of synthesis and its extensions. To make this a bit more precise, the traditional synthesis problem for LTLF is the following. Given a formula phi and a threshold v, compute a transducer that achieves value of at least v for every input computation, or answer that no such transducer exists. In 2016, we studied this quantitative extension, and in particular solved the synthesis problem for it. We show that the complexity is still 2x time. So how do we lift this to GE synthesis? It's actually not entirely clear, and we propose 2 approaches. In the first approach, we're again given a threshold v, and we want to compute a transducer that achieves value of at least v for every v-hopeful input sequence, where a sequence is v-hopeful if there is some output for which it gives value at least v. This makes sense, but it doesn't quite capture quantitativeness, since we essentially reduce the quantitative aspect back to a Boolean one using a threshold. A more quantitative approach takes only a formula and computes a transducer that gives, for every input x, the maximal possible satisfaction value that this input can give over any output. This is in a way the best transducer for the formula, which I guess means that best and good enough coincide, having huge implications on my child's ability to clean his room, but I digress. Complexity. The complexity of this problem is 2x time complete. Of course it is. Now let's look again at this problem. We see that in a way, the transducer here gives a different guarantee of satisfaction value depending on how hopeful the input is. This has an assumed guarantee flavor, which we want to extend a bit. Instead of considering the Boolean assumption is x v hopeful and responding with the Boolean guarantee satisfy with value at least v, we can combine the hopefulness and the satisfaction value in a quantitative manner. We do this using a function comb, which, as its name suggests, combines the satisfaction value of the hopefulness formula, exists output such that phi, with the satisfaction of the actual formula phi. The function is given by the designer and should satisfy a very small and reasonable set of monotonicity properties. We'll see examples in a second. Now, the G assumed guarantee realization value of the formula phi by a transducer T is the minimal combined value over all inputs, and the corresponding synthesis problem is to find a transducer that maximizes the realization value. And guess what? This can be solved in 2x time. Some natural examples of the function comb are a quantitative version of implication, taking the maximum between the negation of the assumptions and the guarantees. This means that a high value is attained if either the guarantees are high or the assumptions are low. Another example is 1 minus the difference between the assumptions and guarantees, which measures how close the guarantee is to the assumption. In our case, how close we are to matching the hopefulness. And finally, we can measure the relative success using the ratio of the guarantee and the assumptions. Each combination function suits different settings. We elaborate on this in the paper. The last extension we look at is the stochastic setting. Instead of looking at adversarial environments, we have a stochastic environment generating inputs randomly, and we want to maximize the expected satisfaction value. Oh, and we're actually going to start with a quantitative specification in LTLF, because why not? In 2016, we showed that we can solve this problem for LTLF in, say it with me,
2x time.
2x time. Extending the stochastic setting to the good enough setting is again not clear-cut, and we propose 2 approaches. In the first approach, we again use a combination function, and we measure the expected value of the combination. Then we try to find a transducer that maximizes this expected value. Intuitively, this means we take into account all inputs and factor in the hopefulness within the satisfaction value using the combination function. In the second approach, we still take the assumed guarantee perspective, but we use a stochastic version of assumption by means of conditional expectation. So we look for a transducer that maximizes the expected satisfaction value of the formula, conditioned only on inputs that are v-hopeful for some v. In contrast to the first approach, here we actually factor out all the non-hopeful computations. Both of these versions are, of course, 2x time complete. Okay, let's summarize. Good enough synthesis is a relaxation of traditional synthesis which focuses on hopeful inputs. It is open to many variants. Strong guarantees, where we combine geosynthesis with traditional constraints. We can add flags that indicate the hopefulness status of prefixes. The setting has several extensions to the quantitative domain which are particularly useful for autonomous systems, as well as to the stochastic setting. Moreover, these extensions can be combined, as the jars here suggest. For example, we can add flags to the quantitative setting. The complexity of the problems when solved carefully is 2x time, matching that of LTL. And finally, we have the benefit of several Safroless algorithms. Thanks for listening.